Hi everybody, I'm Hannah Faye. Thank you so much for coming to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to discuss how to find the best CPU. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit. I will be referring to it as the processor or the CPU for the duration of this video. The very first thing you need to determine when you're looking for a CPU is what are you going to be using it for? What type of computer do you have? Do you have a business? Are you going to be using it for gaming? Are you just going to be streaming Netflix? The cost and power of your CPU is going to vary depending on what you need it for. Gamers are probably going to be at the top of the list. Gamers and people with intense workstations. They're going to need the most powerful types of CPUs. The home user, the average home user, is probably going to need a pretty basic CPU. If you're just browsing the internet, maybe playing solitaire every once in a while, you don't need a very fancy one. Determine what type of software you're going to use, because this is going to determine how big of a cache you need and how many cores your processor needs. Speaking of that, what the heck are cores and cache? Cores are like lanes for information to travel down. If you have a processor with one core, it's called a single core processor, and that can only send one set of instructions at a time in that one core. But if you have a processor that has two cores, then two sets of instructions can be sent at the same time. And this is why processors with multiple cores are more powerful. And you might have heard about threading too. Threads are like mini cores. So it's like your core can have a certain amount of threads, and that just contributes to the speed. But you want to determine what kind of software you have, because the more cores doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good for you. If you're building a computer for your grandma and she's just going to be using it to like talk to you on Facebook, she doesn't need an 8-core processor, because the software that she's using can't utilize all those cores. So you might hear things like single core, dual core, octa-core, quad core. Quad core would become before octa-core. But you know, most of the processors on the market today are multi-core. Cache is a little memory. It's a hardware memory that your CPU uses. And basically, what is stored in this little cache is instructions that are very frequently used by your computer. Your CPU will store instructions that it finds itself using over and over in the cache. And the reason for this is because the cache is right next to the CPU, so it can like just quickly zip over and get that information. Whereas if there's a set of instructions that isn't in the cache, it has to go down to RAM, which is farther away, and so it takes longer. So the cache is a way to just speed things up a little bit, and so obviously a bigger cache can hold more instructions. Frequency is the speed of a CPU. CPUs are measured in hertz, and 1 hertz is 1 processor cycle per second. A kilohertz is 1,000 processor cycles per second. A megahertz is 1 million processor cycles per second, and gigahertz is 1 billion processor cycles per second. So for example, my CPU has a base speed of 3.6 gigahertz, so that means 3.6 billion processor cycles per second. You can overclock some CPUs, probably most CPUs, not all, but quite a few. You can overclock your CPU to increase the frequency. Overclocking does void the manufacturer's warranty, and also your CPU must be unlocked in order to overclock it. And if you do overclock it, you're gonna need more power, and you're also gonna need probably a better cooling system. Some CPUs have integrated graphics on them, so that is something that you need to determine. Do you need a CPU that has graphics or one that doesn't? Because if you have an aftermarket graphic card, I keep saying that wrong. If you have an aftermarket graphics card, you probably don't need integrated graphics on your CPU. But if you do not have a graphics card, you need a CPU that has graphics on it. If you want to upgrade down the line, you can use an aftermarket GPU with a CPU that has integrated graphics, just so you know. If you're unsure of what you might use in the future, I would recommend going with integrated graphics. My processor does not have integrated graphics because I knew that I would be using a graphics card. Of course, we need to talk about the brand. There's Intel or AMD. It doesn't really matter. They are so comparable anymore. For a long time, Intel was much better than AMD, and AMD was kind of like the lower end, but that's not really the case anymore. AMD has surpassed Intel, I think, in the power in some of their CPUs, so I personally am not brand loyal, but I have always used Intel. I'm not opposed to using AMD. Maybe I am a little brand loyal to Intel. I think AMD tends to be cheaper. That used to be the case. I maybe shouldn't say that because I'm not sure anymore. Last but not least, let's talk about the socket, because that's so important. Every CPU has a certain socket type, and certain socket types only fit into certain motherboards that have that socket type. So you can't just buy any CPU and any motherboard and expect them to fit together. If you already have your motherboard, you need to determine what type of socket that already has and find a CPU with that socket. If you don't have a motherboard already and you're maybe buying everything new, then you don't really need to worry about it as much because you can just find a motherboard with that socket. I tend to get the processor before the motherboard. Just make sure that the CPU and your motherboard have the same socket. It usually is something like a couple letters followed by some numbers, like LGA 1200 or something like that. I hope that this video gave you a little bit of insight. Hopefully when you're looking for a CPU, you can make sense of all the specifications now. If you have any questions, make sure you leave them down below, and remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!